The Subaru's engine wheezed like a dying animal as I pulled into Copper Center, Alaska. October wind sliced through the cracked windshield seal, carrying the bite of early winter. My breath fogged the glass as I squinted through the gathering dusk at this speck of civilization clinging to the Richardson Highway. 29 years old and down to my last $800. The crumpled envelope in my glove compartment held everything I had left after 2 years of feeding slot machines in Reno. My house, gone. My car, repossessed. This rust bucket borrowed from a cousin who'd stopped returning my calls. Sarah's engagement ring, pawned 3 months ago for one last desperate bet that didn't pay off. The highway stretched behind me like a scar through the wilderness, flanked by spruce trees heavy with snow. Jagged peaks clawed at a sky the color of old bruises. I'd driven 18 hours straight from Fairbanks, fueled by gas station coffee and the kind of desperation that makes you believe geography can solve your problems. Copper Center wasn't much to look at. A diner with steamed windows glowed yellow against the darkening landscape. A handful of cabins scattered along the roadside, their chimneys smoking thin gray lines into the twilight. 2 gas stations faced each other across the asphalt like gunslingers at dawn. The new Chevron blazed with LED lights, its parking lot packed with 18-wheelers. Truckers moved between the pumps and the attached convenience store, their voices carrying on the wind. Warm, safe, normal. Across the road, Midnight Express gas slouched in the shadows like something forgotten. Its neon sign flickered erratically. Midnight Express, the letters guttering like candles in a draft. The building looked older, its white paint peeling, windows smudged with years of road grime. 2 ancient pumps stood sentinel in the weak glow of overhead lights. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since Fairbanks. The diner's warmth beckoned, promising coffee and maybe some answers about work in this forgotten corner of Alaska. The bell above the diner door chimed as I stepped inside. Heat hit my face like a slap, carrying the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee. A handful of locals occupied red vinyl booths, their conversations dying as they sized up the stranger. The waitress behind the counter had steel gray hair and a scar running from her left ear to the corner of her mouth. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for the pot. "Please." I slid onto a cracked stool, grateful for the warmth. "I'm looking for work. Anything available around here?" She poured the coffee, black, bitter, perfect, and studied me with pale blue eyes. "Depends on what you can do. Trucking companies always looking for drivers, but you need a CDL. Logging outfit might take you on, but that's seasonal work." I sipped the coffee, feeling it burn down my throat. "Anything else?" Her gaze flicked to the window, toward the darkened gas station across the road. "There's a night shift opening at Midnight Express, but I wouldn't recommend it." "Why not?" She wiped the counter with a rag that had seen better days. "That place ain't right after dark. Stick to the Chevron if you're smart, kid." The scar on her cheek twitched as she spoke, and something in her tone made my skin crawl. But $800 wouldn't last long, and I'd learned not to be picky about work. Where would I apply? She jerked her chin toward a bulletin board by the door. "Flyer's been up there for weeks. Can't seem to keep anyone in that position." The board was covered with the usual small-town notices: yard sales, lost cats, church suppers. The flyer was tucked in the corner, its edges yellowed with age. Night shift attendant needed. Midnight Express gas, $18 per hour, remote, reliable only. Draws normal and strange customers. Strange customers. The phrase stuck in my mind as I copied the phone number into my phone. $18 an hour wasn't much, but it was more than I'd made in months. "You sure about this?" the waitress asked when I returned to the counter. "I need the work." She shook her head, refilling my cup without being asked. "Your funeral, kid." The phone rang 3 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Carl speaking. I'm calling about the night shift position at Midnight Express." A pause. "You available to start tonight?" "Yes, sir. Meet me at the station at 9. Bring ID and be ready to work." The line went dead. I checked my watch, 7:30 p.m. Just enough time to grab a burger and steal my nerves. At 9 o'clock sharp, I pulled into the gravel lot of Midnight Express gas. My headlights swept across the building, revealing details the distance had hidden. The white paint wasn't just peeling, it was blistered, as if the building had been burned and hastily repainted. The windows were thick with grime, reflecting my headlights like dead eyes. The man waiting by the front door looked to be in his 60s, lean and weathered like old leather. His flannel shirt was pressed crisp despite the late hour, and his handshake was firm enough to crack knuckles. Carl Morrison. No relation, I assume. Jake Morrison. No, sir. His eyes were sharp, the kind that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. There was something military in his bearing, the way he stood, the way he assessed me with a single glance. 20 years I've been managing this place, he said, unlocking the front door. Never had a problem, long as the rules get followed. You follow rules, Jake? Yes, sir. The interior smelled of dust and old coffee, with an underlying sweetness I couldn't identify. A cash register that belonged in a museum sat on a scarred wooden counter. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with the usual gas station fare, chips, candy, energy drinks. A humming cooler cast blue light across the linoleum floor. Carl led me behind the counter to a cramped office. The walls were bare except for a single phone and a steel door that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. This is where you'll spend most of your time, he said, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. Simple work, pump gas, sell snacks, keep the place clean. He pulled a manila envelope from a desk drawer and counted out 10 $20 bills. Advance on your first week. You'll need it for supplies. The cash felt real in my hands, more money than I'd held in months, but something about the way Carl watched me made my skin crawl. There are rules, he said, producing a sheet of paper from the same drawer. 7 of them. Follow them exactly, and you'll be fine. He read them aloud, his voice steady as a drill sergeant's. 1. Keep all exterior lights on at all times. Replace burned bulbs immediately. 2. If you hear someone calling your name from outside between 2 and 3 a.m., ignore it. It's not a person. 3. If a child enters alone, do not acknowledge them. Continue working, and they will leave. 4. Never answer the store phone between 3:17 a.m. and 3:23 a.m., no matter how many times it rings. 5. If someone asks for directions to the old mining camp, tell them it burned down in 1987. 6. If a car pulls up with no one inside and the air gets hot, lock yourself in the office until the car goes away. 7. Only call me during emergencies. The rules hung in the air like smoke. I read them again, looking for some hint that this was a joke. Carl's expression remained stone serious. Questions? He asked. 1,000 questions crowded my throat, but the weight of the cash in my pocket kept them there. No, sir? Good. He stood, straightening his flannel. Stick to the rules, kid. They're your lifeline. He showed me the rest of the station, the supply closet, the circuit breaker, the ancient coffee machine. Everything felt normal except for the leather-bound logbook beside the register. Its pages were yellow with age, filled with entries in different handwriting. Log everything, Carl said. Sales, incidents, anything unusual. The book's been here longer than I have. I flipped through a few pages. Most entries were mundane. Gas sales, inventory notes. But scattered throughout were stranger notations. Child at 2:50 a.m., ignored. Phone rang 3:20 a.m., no answer. Hot air at 4 a.m., locked in office. Previous employees? I asked. Some. Carl's tone suggested the subject was closed. He walked me through the register system, showed me how to activate the pumps, explained the cleaning routine. Normal gas station work, except for the rules hanging over everything like a storm cloud. I'll be back tomorrow night to check on you, he said, heading for the door. Remember, follow the rules exactly. They've kept me alive for 20 years. The door chimed as he left, and I watched through the grimy window as his pickup truck disappeared into the darkness. The silence that followed felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. I was alone. The cooler hummed. Wind rattled the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a truck's engine faded into nothing. I checked my watch. 9:45 p.m. 8 hours until dawn. I pulled out the rules and read them again, trying to make sense of the warnings. Don't acknowledge children. Don't answer the phone at specific times. Lock yourself in the office if a car shows up empty. The logical part of my mind insisted this was all nonsense, the eccentric policies of a paranoid old man. But something deeper, some primitive instinct honed by millions of years of evolution, whispered that Carl's calm certainty came from experience. A bulb flickered outside, drawing my attention to Rule 1. I found a replacement in the supply closet and stepped into the October night. The cold hit me like a physical blow, and the darkness beyond the station's glow seemed absolute. I changed the bulb quickly, my fingers numb despite the work gloves. Back inside, I noticed scratches on the nearest gas pump, deep gouges in the metal that looked almost like claw marks. The logical explanation was vandalism, but the marks were too regular, too purposeful. I opened the logbook to the most recent entry, dated 3 days ago. Quiet night. Followed all rules. No incidents. Marcus. The handwriting was shaky, like it had been written by someone with unsteady hands. I turned to a fresh page and wrote, October 15th, 2025, 10 p.m., Jake Morrison starting shift. All lights operational. The words looked small and insignificant on the yellowed paper. I closed the book and settled in for what I hoped would be an uneventful night. Outside, the wind picked up, and I could swear I heard something that sounded almost like my name. Almost. The first few hours passed like any normal gas station shift. A trucker pulled up at 10:30, his rig hissing as the air brakes engaged. He was a big man with calloused hands and tired eyes, buying coffee and beef jerky while his diesel tank filled. "You new here?" he asked, counting out crumpled bills. "First night." He glanced around the store, his gaze lingering on the shadows beyond the fluorescent lights. "Carl, give you the talk?" "About what?" "The rules." The trucker's voice dropped to a whisper. "Follow them, kid. This place, it's got a reputation on the highway. Drivers talk." Before I could ask what kind of reputation, he was gone, his truck's taillights disappearing into the darkness. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. I busied myself with inventory, counting candy bars and checking expiration dates. The work felt normal, grounding. Stock the shelves, wipe the counters, log the sales, basic retail, nothing more. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh white light that made the shadows beyond seem deeper by contrast. At 11:15, another customer arrived, a woman in a Honda Civic with out-of-state plates. She moved quickly, pumping gas with nervous energy, glancing over her shoulder at the darkness beyond the station's glow. When she came inside to pay, her hands shook as she counted out 20s. "This place gives me the creeps," she muttered, not quite meeting my eyes. "Just passing through? Thank God." She grabbed her receipt and hurried back to her car, engine starting before her door fully closed. I watched her taillights fade, wondering what had spooked her so badly. The station felt ordinary enough, old and run down, sure, but not particularly frightening. Maybe it was just the isolation, the way the darkness pressed against the windows like something alive. At 11:30, I found the drawing. It was tucked under the cash register, a piece of construction paper folded in half. The crayon marks were crude but deliberate, a child's drawing of the gas station, complete with the flickering neon sign and the 2 pumps out front. But there was something else in the picture, a dark figure standing just beyond the reach of the lights. The figure had no features, just a black silhouette with arms that seemed too long. At the bottom, in wobbly letters that could only belong to a young child, someone had written, "Friend." My stomach clenched. I turned the paper over looking for a name or date, but found nothing. The crayon was still waxy to the touch, as if the drawing had been made recently. Very recently. I shoved it into the desk drawer, telling myself it was probably left by some kid whose parents had stopped for gas. Kids drew weird things all the time, but the image stuck in my mind, that dark figure with its 2 long arms, standing just outside the circle of light. The logbook called to me from beside the register. I flipped through more pages, looking for similar incidents. Most entries were mundane, but scattered throughout were stranger notations that made my skin crawl. Child drawing found under counter, disposed of. Sarah, March 2024. Drawing appeared again, same figure, same handwriting. Mike, June 2024. Third drawing this month. Kids getting bolder. Tom, September 2024. The dates spanned years, but the handwriting in the margin notes was always described the same way. Wobbly, childish, spelling friend at the bottom. Different employees, same phenomenon. I closed the book and checked the time. 11:45 p.m. Still hours to go. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows with increasing violence. One of the exterior lights flickered, the same bulb I'd replaced earlier. I grabbed another replacement from the supply closet, dreading the walk outside. The cold hit me like a slap. The wind carried the scent of snow and something else, something organic and unpleasant, like meat left too long in the sun. I changed the bulb quickly, my fingers numb despite the work gloves. As I worked, I noticed the scratches on the gas pump more clearly. They weren't random vandalism. They formed a pattern, like claw marks raked across the metal in deliberate strokes. 4 parallel lines, each about an inch apart. Too big for a cat, too small for a bear, and too regular to be accidental. Back inside, the warmth felt like a blessing. I logged the bulb replacement and tried to focus on normal tasks, restocking the coffee station, checking the cooler temperature, counting the till, anything to keep my mind off the growing sense that something was wrong with this place. At midnight, the phone rang. I reached for it automatically, then stopped. Rule 4 flashed in my mind. Never answer the store phone between 3:17 a.m. and 3:23 a.m. It was only midnight, safe to answer. Midnight Express Gas. Static crackled on the line, punctuated by what sounded like breathing, heavy, labored breathing, as if someone was running or struggling. Hello? I tried again. The breathing continued for another 10 seconds, then the line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. Wrong numbers happened all the time. Drunk calls, kids playing pranks, nothing unusual about it. But the breathing had sounded wrong. Too deep, too wet, like someone with fluid in their lungs. I logged the call in the book. 12 a.m. prank call. Heavy breathing, no voice. Flipping back through the pages, I found similar entries. 11:47 p.m. Strange call. Breathing only. Janet, April 2021. 12:15 a.m. Phone call, no voice, just breathing. Wet sound. Dave, July 2019. The pattern was clear. Different employees, different dates, but the same phenomenon. Heavy, wet breathing on the midnight calls. I checked the exterior lights through the window, all functioning, casting their harsh glow across the empty lot. The darkness beyond seemed absolute, as if the light simply stopped at an invisible barrier. No stars, no moon, just black void pressing against the station like a living thing. At 12:30, a pickup truck pulled up to pump 2. The driver was a local. I could tell by his relaxed demeanor, and the way he nodded at me through the window. He filled his tank slowly, in no hurry, then came inside for cigarettes and an energy drink. "Quiet night," he said, sliding a 20 across the counter. "So far." He glanced around the store, taking in the flickering lights and dusty shelves. "You know about the old mining camp?" The question hit me like ice water. Rule 5. If someone asks for directions to the old mining camp, tell them it burned down in 1987. "Burned down in 1987, I said automatically. The man's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his weathered features. That's what they all say. Funny thing is, I was here in 87. Never was no fire. He left without another word, his truck's engine fading into the distance. I stood behind the counter, my hands trembling slightly. The man had been testing me, seeing if I knew the rules. But why? And what was the real story behind the mining camp? I pulled out my phone, hoping for cell service, but found nothing. No bars, no data connection. The station's landline was my only link to the outside world, and after the midnight call, I wasn't eager to use it. The cooler's compressor kicked on with a shudder that ran through the floor. The sound was loud in the silence, making me jump. I was getting paranoid, seeing threats in every shadow, hearing menace in every ordinary noise. But as I restocked the candy rack, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Frost. A thin layer of ice crystals had formed on the inside of the cooler's glass door, despite the unit running normally. The frost formed a pattern, not random, but deliberate, like fingers had traced shapes in the condensation. I opened the cooler door, feeling the rush of cold air. The frost melted immediately, leaving no trace of the patterns I'd seen. But the memory remained, finger-like marks spelling out letters. Help. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. Condensation formed patterns all the time. Humidity, temperature changes, perfectly normal explanations. But the letters had been too clear, too deliberate. The logbook beckoned again. I flipped to a random page from 6 months ago. Frost patterns in cooler. Looks like writing, can't make out words. Tom, April 2021. Frost message getting clearer. Same word every time. Someone's trapped. Mike, June 2024. My hands shook as I turned the pages. Entry after entry, different employees reporting the same phenomenon. Frost forming letters on the cooler door, always spelling the same word. Help. I checked the time. 12:45 a.m. Still hours until dawn, and already the station was showing its true nature. The normal facade was cracking, revealing something darker underneath. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the windows with increasing violence. One of the fluorescent lights flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The shadows seemed to move independently, writhing and twisting in ways that defied the light source. I forced myself to focus on routine tasks. Clean the coffee station, check the register, log the sales, normal work to keep the growing dread at bay. But as I wiped down the counter, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Small, wet footprints leading from the front door to the cooler, then disappearing. Child-sized prints, as if someone had walked through puddles before entering the store, but it hadn't rained. The ground outside was dry, covered with frost but no standing water, and I would have heard the door chime if someone had entered. I grabbed paper towels and wiped up the prints, my hands shaking. The water was ice cold, almost freezing, and it left my fingers numb. As I cleaned, I noticed the prints led directly to where I'd seen the frost patterns on the cooler door. The connection was impossible to ignore. Someone, or something, had been in the store, leaving wet footprints and writing messages in the frost. But I'd been watching the door all night. No one had entered, no one I could see. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Rule 3. If a child enters alone, do not acknowledge them. Continue working, and they will leave. A child had been here. I just hadn't seen them. The clock above the register ticked toward 2 a.m. with mechanical indifference. Each second felt like an eternity, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence that had settled over the station. I'd cleaned every surface twice, reorganized the candy rack, and checked the exterior lights so many times I could navigate the routine blindfolded. But I couldn't shake the image of those wet footprints, child-sized, leading to the cooler where Frost had spelled out a desperate plea for help. The logbook lay open beside me, its yellowed pages filled with decades of similar encounters. I'd been reading entry after entry, trying to understand the pattern, the rules that governed this place. Each previous employee had documented the same phenomena: the calls, the drawings, the frost messages, the footprints, and they all mentioned Rule 3. At 1:45 a.m., I made fresh coffee, more for something to do than because I needed caffeine. My hands were already shaking from nerves and too much gas station brew. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, the only sound besides the cooler's constant hum and the wind battering the windows. The fluorescent lights flickered more frequently now, casting the store in intermittent darkness. Each time the lights dimmed, the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, taking on shapes that my rational mind insisted were just tricks of tired eyes and frayed nerves. But deep down, I knew better. At 1:58 a.m., I heard my name. Jake. The voice came from outside, soft and distant, barely audible over the wind. I froze, coffee cup halfway to my lips, every muscle in my body tensing. Jake, please. Rule 2 blazed in my mind like neon. If you hear someone calling your name from outside between 2 and 3 a.m., ignore it. It's not a person. The voice sounded familiar. achingly, heartbreakingly familiar. Sarah's voice, the same tone she'd used when she found the gambling receipts hidden in my dresser drawer, when she'd begged me to get help, to stop throwing our future away on cards and dice and spinning wheels. "Jake, I need you." My hand moved toward the door handle before I caught myself. The voice was perfect, every inflection, every subtle accent that marked Sarah as a California transplant. But Sarah was in Reno, probably sleeping next to the insurance adjuster she'd started dating after I'd pawned her grandmother's ring. "Jake, come outside, please." The pleading in the voice made my chest ache. I gripped the counter, knuckles white, forcing myself to stay put. Carl's rules had kept him alive for 20 years. They'd kept previous employees safe. I had to trust them. But God, it sounded so much like her. I focused on restocking the candy bars, hands trembling as I arranged Snickers and Kit Kats in neat rows. The voice continued calling, growing more desperate, more insistent. Sometimes it was Sarah. Sometimes it was my sister Amy, asking why I never called anymore. Once, it was my father's voice, rough with disappointment, asking why I'd thrown away everything he'd worked to give me. Each voice was perfect. Each one knew exactly what to say to make me want to open that door. At 2:30, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the calling. It felt expectant, as if something was waiting just beyond the circle of light, watching for any sign of weakness. I checked the exterior lights through the window, all functioning, casting their harsh glow across the empty lot. But the darkness beyond seemed deeper now, more absolute. It pressed against the light like a living thing, hungry and patient. The clock ticked toward 2:45 a.m. That's when the door chimed. I looked up from the register, expecting to see another late-night traveler seeking coffee and directions. Instead, a child stood just inside the entrance, small and pale in the fluorescent light. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, wearing a faded pink parka that looked decades out of style. Her dark hair hung in limp strands around a face that was too white, too still. She stood perfectly motionless, not even seeming to breathe. Rule 3 screamed in my mind: if a child enters alone, do not acknowledge them. Continue working, and they will leave. I forced myself to look away, focusing on the inventory sheet in front of me. The numbers blurred as I tried to count cases of motor oil, my peripheral vision tracking the small figure by the door. She moved, not walking, gliding. Her feet made no sound on the linoleum as she drifted toward the cooler section. I kept my eyes fixed on the paperwork, but I could feel her presence like a cold weight in the air. The temperature dropped. My breath began to fog, and frost started forming on the windows despite the heater running full blast. The cooler's compressor kicked into overdrive, struggling against the sudden chill. The child stopped in front of the beverage cooler, her reflection visible in the glass door. But something was wrong with the reflection. While the child stood still, her mirror image moved independently, pressing tiny hands against the glass from the inside. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood, using the pain to keep myself focused on the inventory. Don't acknowledge. Don't look directly. Continue working. The reflection's mouth opened in a silent scream. Frost began forming on the cooler door again, but not random patterns this time. Letters appeared in the condensation, traced by invisible fingers. Cold. So cold. Help me. The child, the real one, not the reflection, turned toward me. I could feel her gaze like ice water on my skin, but I kept my eyes fixed on the paperwork. The numbers swam before my vision as the temperature continued to drop. My coffee cup developed a skin of ice. The fluorescent lights flickered more violently, and in the strobing illumination, I caught glimpses of the child's shadow on the wall. It was wrong, too tall, too angular, with appendages that stretched and writhed like tentacles. The shadow moved independently of its caster, reaching toward me with fingers that ended in points. I gripped the inventory sheet so hard the paper crinkled. Continue working, don't acknowledge. She'll leave. But what if she didn't? The cold was becoming unbearable. My fingers were numb, my breath coming in visible puffs. The heater rattled and wheezed, fighting a losing battle against the supernatural chill. More letters appeared on the cooler door. Please look at me. I'm so alone. Every instinct screamed at me to help, to acknowledge the desperate plea, but Carl's voice echoed in my memory. Follow the rules exactly. They've kept me alive for 20 years. The child took another step closer. I could smell her now, the scent of old snow and something else, something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in a vase, sweet decay masked by winter air. The shadow on the wall grew larger, more distorted. In my peripheral vision, I saw it reaching for me, those pointed fingers stretching across the ceiling. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the cold stopped. The temperature normalized. The frost on the windows melted instantly, running down the glass in rivulets. The fluorescent lights steadied, casting their normal, harsh glow. I looked up. The child was gone, but the message on the cooler door remained, letters slowly fading as the frost melted. Thank you. I sat there shaking, my whole body trembling from more than just the cold. The clock read 2:52 a.m., 8 minutes. The encounter had lasted 8 minutes that felt like hours. I logged the incident with hands that could barely hold the pen. 2:45 a.m. Child entered, followed Rule 3, temperature drop, frost messages, left at 2:52 a.m. Flipping through the logbook, I found similar entries. Child appeared 2:47 a.m., ignored as instructed. Very cold. Frost writing on cooler. Help me and so alone. Left after 6 minutes. Marcus, October 2024. And a few more entries like that. The pattern was clear. The same child, the same pink parka, the same desperate messages. But how many years had she been appearing? I flipped back further, finding entries from the 1990s, the 1980s, even the 1970s. The handwriting changed, the employees changed, but the child remained constant, always 8 years old, always in that faded pink parka, always so very cold. At 3:10 a.m., I noticed the atmospheric pressure change. It was subtle at first, a feeling in my ears like ascending in an airplane. The air grew thick, oppressive, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a thunderstorm. But there were no clouds outside, no weather front moving through. The fluorescent lights began to flicker in a pattern. 3 quick flashes, then steady, then 3 more flashes, like Morse code. SOS. The cooler's hum changed pitch, rising to an almost musical tone. The cash register's display flickered, numbers scrolling randomly across the screen. Even the coffee maker began to gurgle and hiss without being turned on. Every electrical device in the station was responding to something. At 3:15 a.m., the phone rang. I stared at it. Rule 4 burning in my mind. Never answer the store phone between 3:17 a.m. and 3:23 a.m., no matter how many times it rings. It was 3:15, 2 minutes early. Safe to answer. I picked up the receiver. Midnight Express gas. Static filled the line, punctuated by what sounded like voices, distant, distorted, speaking in languages I didn't recognize. Underneath it all was that same wet breathing I'd heard at midnight, but louder now, more labored. Hello? I tried again. The static cleared for a moment, and I heard something that made my blood freeze, my own voice. Can't get out, trapped here, so cold. Help me. It was my voice, but wrong. Desperate, terrified, speaking words I'd never said. In the background, I could hear the familiar sounds of the gas station, the cooler humming, the fluorescent lights buzzing, the wind outside. Been here so long. Can't remember. Please. The line went dead. I sat there holding the receiver, my hand shaking so badly I could barely keep it to my ear. My own voice, begging for help from somewhere that sounded exactly like where I was sitting. The clock read 3:17 a.m. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't move. Rule 4 was absolute. Never answer between 3:17 and 3:23 a.m. The phone shrieked in the silence, each ring like a physical blow. The sound was wrong, too shrill, too insistent, with harmonics that made my teeth ache. Ring. The lights dimmed with each peal, as if the phone was drawing power from the entire station. The cooler's hum grew louder, more aggressive. The coffee maker began to smoke. Ring. Frost started forming on every glass surface, the windows, the cooler doors, even my coffee cup. The temperature plummeted again. But this cold was different. Angry. Ring. The cash register's display showed impossible numbers, negative amounts, dates from decades in the future, prices that climbed into the millions. Ring. Something moved in my peripheral vision. Shadows that shouldn't exist, cast by no visible source. They writhed across the walls like living things, reaching toward the phone with grasping tendrils. Ring. The urge to answer was overwhelming. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was important, that someone needed help, that ignoring the call was condemning them to suffering. But Carl's rules had kept him alive for 20 years. I gripped the counter and endured. At 3:23 a.m., the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No cooler hum, no fluorescent buzz, no wind outside. Even my own heartbeat seemed muffled. The station held its breath, waiting. Then slowly, the normal sounds returned. The cooler resumed its steady hum. The lights stopped flickering. The frost on the windows began to melt. I checked the clock. 3:24 a.m. 6 minutes. 6 minutes of hell that felt like hours. I logged the incident with trembling hands. 3:17 to 3:23 a.m. Phone rang continuously. Did not answer per Rule 4. Electrical disturbances, temperature drop, shadows moving. Stopped at 3:23 a.m. exactly. I flipped through more pages, finding a pattern that made my stomach churn. Employees who broke Rule 4. Employees who answered the phone during those 6 cursed minutes. Employees who disappeared. Their voices joined the chorus on the line, begging future workers for help that would never come. The station was a trap, a place where the desperate and the foolish came to work, drawn by decent wages and the promise of solitude. But solitude was the last thing you found here. You found the voices of everyone who'd come before, everyone who'd broken the rules, everyone who'd become part of whatever haunted this place. At 3:30 a.m., I made a decision. I was going to survive this night. I was going to follow every rule exactly as Carl had written them, and when dawn came, I was going to walk away and never look back. But first, I had to make it through the next 2.5 hours, and something told me the worst was yet to come. The hours between 3:30 and 4 a.m. crawled by like wounded animals. I busied myself with mindless tasks, wiping already clean counters, straightening perfectly aligned candy bars, checking and rechecking the exterior lights. Anything to keep my hands moving and my mind off the growing certainty that something was building toward a climax. The station felt different now, charged, like the air before a tornado touches down. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound amplified. The cooler's hum had developed an almost musical quality, rising and falling in patterns that reminded me of breathing. The fluorescent lights flickered in rhythm, as if the entire building had developed a heartbeat. At 3:45 a.m., I found another drawing. This one was different from the crude crayon sketch I'd discovered earlier. It was done in pencil, with an adult's steady hand, showing the gas station in photorealistic detail. Every crack in the pavement, every rust stain on the pumps, every smudge on the windows, all perfectly rendered. But the perspective was wrong. The drawing showed the station from above as if viewed from the sky, or from very high up. And there were figures in the drawing, dozens of them, standing in the darkness beyond the lights. Men, women, children, all facing the station with expressions of desperate hunger. Their eyes were black voids, their mouths open in silent screams. At the bottom, in the same shaky handwriting I'd seen before, someone had written, "They're waiting." I shoved the drawing into the desk drawer with the others, my hands trembling. The logbook called to me, and I flipped through more pages, finding similar artwork scattered throughout the decades. Always the same perspective, always the same hungry figures in the darkness, always the same message. They're waiting. At 3:55 a.m., the temperature began to rise, not the gradual warmth of a heater kicking in, but a sudden, oppressive heat that made the air shimmer. Within minutes, the station felt like a furnace. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and my shirt clung to my back. I checked the thermostat. It read 55 degrees, the same setting it had been on all night. But the air felt like it was pushing 90. The heat was coming from outside. Through the grimy windows, I could see waves of distortion rising from the asphalt, like summer heat mirages. But it was October in Alaska, with frost on the ground and snow in the forecast. At exactly 4 a.m., I heard the car. The engine sound was wrong from the start. Too smooth, too quiet, like an electric motor rather than internal combustion. Headlights swept across the windows as the vehicle pulled up to pump 2, but when I looked outside, my blood turned to ice. The car was a black sedan, sleek and modern, with tinted windows that reflected the station's lights like mirrors. But there was no one inside. The driver's seat was empty, the steering wheel turning by itself as the car positioned itself perfectly at the pump. Rule 6 blazed in my mind. If a car pulls up with no one inside and the air gets hot, lock yourself in the office until the car goes away. The heat was already unbearable, and now I understood why. This was the warning, the signal that something far worse than a child's ghost or phantom phone calls had arrived. I ran for the office, my feet slipping on the suddenly slick linoleum. The steel door felt like salvation as I slammed it shut and threw the bolt. The office was cramped and windowless, lit by a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows in the corners. But even through the steel door, I could hear what was happening outside. The pump activated. I could hear the mechanical click of the nozzle engaging, the whoosh of fuel flowing through the lines. But there was no one to operate it. The car was filling itself, the numbers on the pump display climbing steadily. The heat was getting worse. Even in the sealed office, the temperature was rising. Sweat poured down my face, and my breathing became labored. The air felt thick, oppressive, like trying to breathe underwater. Through the thin gap under the door, I could see light, not the harsh fluorescent glow of the station, but something else. Something that flickered and danced like flames. The car's engine revved, a sound like distant thunder. But underneath it, I heard something else. Voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once in a language that hurt to hear. The words seemed to bypass my ears and go straight to my brain, filling my skull with alien syllables that made my teeth ache. The pump stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear what was happening. The voices had stopped, but I could feel something moving outside, a presence so vast and alien that my mind refused to process it fully. Then came the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the office door. The steel rang like a bell with each impact, the sound reverberating through the small space. Knock, knock, knock. A voice spoke from the other side, my own voice, but wrong, hollow, empty. Jake, open the door, Jake. I pressed myself against the far wall, as far from the door as the cramped space allowed. The voice continued, patient and persistent. I know you're in there, Jake. I can smell your fear. It's delicious. The doorknob rattled, testing the lock. The bolt held, but I could see it straining against whatever force was trying to get in. You can't hide forever, Jake. Eventually, you'll have to come out. And when you do, I'll be waiting. The voice changed, becoming Sarah's again, perfect in every detail, down to the slight lisp she'd had as a child. Jake, honey, please open the door. I drove all the way from Reno to see you. Don't you want to see me? My hand moved toward the bolt before I caught myself. The voice was perfect, but Sarah was in Reno. Sarah had moved on. Sarah would never drive to Alaska to find the man who destroyed their future. Jake, I forgive you. For everything. The gambling, the lies, the ring. None of it matters now. Just open the door. Tears ran down my face, mixing with the sweat. The voice was so convincing, so full of the love I'd thrown away. But I remembered Carl's words. Follow the rules exactly. They've kept me alive for 20 years. The knocking resumed, more insistent now. The steel door buckled with each impact, and I could see hairline cracks forming in the metal. Whatever was outside was getting stronger, more desperate. Open the door, Jake! The voice was no longer human. It was a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, shaking the walls and making the light bulb flicker. The temperature spiked even higher, and I could smell something burning. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The knocking ceased. The voice fell silent. The oppressive heat began to fade, replaced by the normal chill of an Alaskan October night. I waited, counting my heartbeats, afraid to move. Minutes passed. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the cooler in the main store. Finally, I crept to the door and pressed my ear against the steel. Nothing. No movement, no breathing, no sign of the presence that had been trying to get in. I checked my watch. 4:15 a.m. 15 minutes. The encounter had lasted 15 minutes that felt like hours. Slowly, carefully, I slid back the bolt and cracked the door open. The main store was empty, lit by the normal fluorescent glow. The temperature was back to normal, the air no longer thick and oppressive, but the pump outside showed 13.13 gallons dispensed. I logged the incident with shaking hands. 4 a.m., empty car, black sedan. Air became hot, locked in office per Rule 6. Knocking on door, voices. Left at 4:15 a.m., pump shows 13.13 gallons. The logbook was full of similar entries, each employee documenting their own encounter with the empty car. But some entries were different, more disturbing. Car arrived 4:02 a.m. Didn't lock office fast enough. It got inside. Found me in the morning, catatonic. Don't remember anything after the knocking started. Mike, August 2023. Empty car 4 a.m. Ignored Rule 6. Thought I could handle it. Woke up 3 days later in Fairbanks Hospital. No memory of how I got there. Quitting. Sarah, November 2023. Car came again. This time I was ready. Locked office immediately. But I could hear it talking to someone else out there. Another employee? But I'm supposed to be alone. Tom, January 2024. That last entry made my blood run cold. Another employee? But Carl had said nothing about working with a partner. I was supposed to be alone on the night shift, unless the other employee wasn't alive. I thought about the voices on the phone, the desperate pleas for help. The employees who'd broken the rules and disappeared. What if they hadn't really left? What if they were still here, trapped in whatever nightmare dimension existed alongside the gas station? The thought was too horrible to contemplate, but it explained so much. The drawings that appeared overnight, the frost messages, the voices calling my name. They were all here, all the previous employees who'd failed to follow the rules, trapped in the spaces between, able to interact with the physical world, but never truly part of it. At 4:30 a.m., I made a decision that nearly cost me everything. I reached for the phone to call Carl. My finger hovered over the numbers, Rule 7 echoing in my mind. Only call me during emergencies. Was this an emergency? I'd survived the encounters so far, followed the rules exactly as written. But the night felt like it was building towards something bigger, something the rules might not be enough to handle. I started to dial, then stopped. Carl's voice echoed in my memory. Follow the rules exactly. They've kept me alive for 20 years. Not, call me if things get bad. Not, use your judgment. Follow the rules exactly. I set the phone down, trusting in Carl's experience. He'd survived 20 years in this place. He knew what he was talking about. But as I turned away from the phone, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. A figure standing just outside the circle of light, watching me through the window. It looked like Carl. But Carl had left hours ago, driving away in his rusted pickup truck. And this figure was wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with shadows where its face should be. As I watched, it raised one hand in a slow wave, then melted back into the darkness. I checked the clock, 4:45 a.m. An hour and 15 minutes until dawn. An hour and 15 minutes until I could walk away from this nightmare and never look back. But something told me the worst was yet to come. The station was saving its final test for last. The final hour stretched before me like an eternity. I'd survived the voices, the child, the phantom phone calls, and the empty car. But the station felt different now, expectant, as if it knew dawn was coming and was preparing one last assault on my sanity. At 5 a.m., the man arrived. He stumbled through the front door like a drunk, the bell chiming his entrance with a sound that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. But this wasn't ordinary intoxication. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. He wore a tattered coat that might have been brown once, but was now the color of old blood. Ash clung to the fabric, and the smell that followed him into the store was overwhelming. Charcoal and smoke and something else, something organic and wrong. His eyes were the worst part. They were glassy, unfocused, but they tracked my movement with predatory precision. When he spoke, his voice was like gravel in a cement mixer. Directions to the old mining camp. Rule 5 blazed in my mind. If someone asks for directions to the old mining camp, tell them it burned down in 1987. It burned down in 1987, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The man stared at me, unblinking. His mouth hung open slightly, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. Ash drifted from his coat to the floor, leaving gray smudges on the linoleum. "Burned down," he repeated, his voice echoing strangely in the small space. "Burned down. Burned down." He began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass that made my teeth ache. The laughter went on too long, rising in pitch until it was almost a scream. Then abruptly, it stopped. "But I can still smell the smoke," he whispered. "Can you smell it, boy? Can you smell us burning?" The temperature in the store began to rise again, but this was different from the supernatural heat that had preceded the empty car. This was the heat of flames, of combustion, of things that should not burn catching fire anyway. Smoke began to seep from the man's coat, thin wisps at first, then thicker clouds that made my eyes water. But there were no flames, no source for the smoke. It simply poured from his clothing like he was a human chimney. "We've been burning for so long," he continued, taking a step closer to the counter. 38 years we've been burning. Do you know what it's like to burn for 38 years? I gripped the edge of the counter, forcing myself to stay calm. The rules had worked so far, they would work now. "It burned down in 1987, I repeated. The man's head tilted, nearly 90 degrees to the left. 1987, yes. That's when it started. That's when we all started burning. More smoke poured from his coat, and now I could see shapes in the gray clouds. Faces, twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. The faces of the miners who had died in whatever fire had consumed the camp. But we're still there, boy. Still burning, still screaming, and we're so very hungry." He reached across the counter with hands that left ashy prints on everything they touched. I jerked backward, but there wasn't far to go in the cramped space behind the register. "Join us," he whispered. "Come to the camp. Come burn with us. It only hurts for the first few decades." The smoke was getting thicker, filling the store with the acrid smell of burning flesh and melting metal. My eyes streamed tears, and my lungs burned with each breath. But I held my ground, repeating the rule like a mantra. "It burned down in 1987. It burned down in 1987. The man's laughter returned, but now it was joined by other voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all laughing and screaming and begging for release. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, like standing inside a blast furnace filled with the damned. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The smoke cleared. The voices fell silent. The man stood perfectly still, his head still tilted at that impossible angle, staring at me with those glassy eyes. 1987, he said finally. "Yes, it burned down in 1987. He turned and walked out of the store, his movements still jerky and unnatural. The bell chimed his departure, and I watched through the window as he shambled into the darkness beyond the lights. But he didn't disappear into the night like the other supernatural visitors. Instead, he stopped at the edge of the light and turned back toward the station. He stood there, perfectly still, watching me through the grimy glass, waiting. I checked the clock, 5:15 a.m., 45 minutes until dawn. The logbook was filled with similar encounters, employees documenting their meetings with the burned man. But unlike the other supernatural events, this one had a different pattern. The man always appeared in the final hour, always asked for directions to the mining camp, and always left when given the proper response. But he never really left. According to the entries, he would stand outside until dawn, watching, waiting for someone to break the rule and acknowledge what had really happened at the mining camp. I found an entry from 1988, just 1 year after the supposed fire. Man in burned coat asked for mining camp, told him it burned down in 87 like Carl instructed. But I know it didn't burn. I was here that night. I saw what really happened. The camp didn't burn. It was consumed, eaten, by something that came up from the deep shafts, something hungry. Carl made us all promise to say it burned, easier than explaining the truth. Bill, March 1988. My hands shook as I read the entry. The mining camp hadn't burned in a fire. Something else had happened, something so terrible that the survivors had agreed to lie about it, to create a cover story that was easier to believe than the truth. And whatever had consumed the camp was still out there, still hungry, sending its victims to recruit new prey. At 5:30 a.m., the station began to change. It started subtly. Shadows that moved independently of their sources, reflections in the windows that showed different scenes than what was actually outside. The fluorescent lights flickered in patterns that almost looked like Morse code, and the cooler's hum developed harmonics that sounded almost like voices. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. The linoleum floor rippled like water, and the ceiling sagged as if under enormous weight. I was witnessing the station's true nature, the reality that existed beneath the mundane facade of a rural gas stop. This place was a nexus, a point where the normal world intersected with something far older and more terrible. The burned man still stood outside, watching through the window. But now he wasn't alone. Other figures had joined him. The child in the pink parka, the previous employees who had answered the phone during the forbidden hours, shapes that might once have been human but were now something else entirely. They all watched me with hungry eyes, waiting for me to make a mistake, to break one of the rules that kept me safe. At 5:45 a.m., I heard the truck. The engine sound was real this time, the familiar rumble of Carl's pickup truck pulling into the lot. Through the window, I could see his headlights cutting through the darkness, and relief flooded through me like a physical force. Carl was back. The night was almost over. I had survived. But as the truck pulled up to the front of the store, I noticed something wrong. The headlights were too bright, too white, like LED bulbs rather than the yellow halogens I'd seen when Carl left. And the engine sound was slightly off, too smooth, too quiet. The truck door opened, and Carl stepped out. But this wasn't the weathered veteran who had hired me. This Carl was wrong, too tall, too thin, with movements that were just slightly out of sync with human motion. He walked to the front door and tried the handle. When it didn't open, he knocked, 3 slow, deliberate raps that echoed the knocking I'd heard on the office door. "Jake," he called, his voice a perfect imitation of the real Carl. "Open up, son. Shift's over." But it wasn't over. I checked the clock. 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes until 6 a.m., when the morning shift worker was supposed to arrive. This wasn't Carl. This was something else, something that had taken his form and was trying to trick me into opening the door. "Jake, I know you're in there. Everything's fine now. You did good, kid. Real good. Now open the door and let me in." The voice was perfect, down to Carl's slight southern accent and the way he said, "really good," instead of "really good." But I remembered his parting words. "I'll be back tomorrow night to check on you. Tomorrow night, not tonight. Come on, Jake. Don't make me stand out here in the cold. You followed all the rules just like I taught you. Now let me in so we can settle up." The thing wearing Carl's face pressed against the window, its breath fogging the glass. In the reflection, I could see its true form, something tall and angular with too many joints, like a praying mantis that had learned to walk upright. "Open the door, Jake." The voice was no longer Carl's. It was the same inhuman roar I'd heard during the empty car incident, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The windows began to crack under the pressure of that voice. The fluorescent lights exploded in showers of sparks. The cooler's compressor seized with a grinding shriek, but I held my ground, counting down the minutes until dawn. At 5:55 a.m., the real morning shift worker arrived. I saw his headlights first, normal yellow halogen beams cutting through the darkness. Then came the sound of a car door slamming, followed by footsteps on gravel. The thing wearing Carl's face turned toward the newcomer, its movements becoming more agitated. It began to flicker, its stolen form becoming unstable as the presence of a genuine human disrupted whatever force allowed it to maintain the disguise. "Hey, weird," a young voice called out. "You okay in there? Your lights are all busted." Ethan, the college kid who worked the morning shift. Normal, human, oblivious to the supernatural drama that had been playing out all night. The fake Carl let out a shriek of frustration and melted back into the shadows, taking all the other watchers with it. The burned man, the child, the previous employees, they all faded like smoke, retreating to whatever dimension they inhabited during the daylight hours. At exactly 6 a.m., Ethan pushed through the front door, yawning and carrying a backpack that probably contained textbooks and energy drinks. "Dude, what happened to the lights?" he asked, looking around at the broken fixtures. "And why does it smell like smoke in here?" I handed him the keys with shaking hands, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The cash register still worked, and I quickly processed the night's sales, eager to complete the handover and get out. "You look like hell," Ethan observed, tossing his backpack onto the counter. "Rough night?" "You could say that." I grabbed my jacket and the envelope containing my pay, $144 for 8 hours of work, plus the $200 advance Carl had given me. Enough to buy a bus ticket to Anchorage and a plane ticket to somewhere warm and far away. "See you tomorrow night?" Ethan asked as I headed for the door. "No," I said without looking back. "I don't think so." The morning air was crisp and clean, free of the oppressive weight that had filled the station all night. My Subaru started on the second try, and I pulled out of the lot without looking back at the building that had nearly claimed my sanity. I drove straight to Anchorage, the Richardson Highway blurring past in a haze of snow-covered spruce and granite peaks. At the airport, I bought a one-way ticket to Seattle with my gas station earnings, craving warmth and the anonymity of a big city. As the plane climbed into the morning sky, I looked down at the wilderness below. Somewhere in that vast expanse of forest and mountain, Midnight Express Gas continued its eternal vigil, waiting for the next desperate soul to answer its job posting. I didn't look back again. 6 months later, browsing job sites in my Seattle apartment, I came across a familiar posting. Nightshift gas station attendant needed, remote location, $18 per hour. Must be reliable and follow instructions exactly. I closed the laptop and poured myself a drink, trying not to think about whoever would answer that ad. Trying not to imagine them reading Carl's rules for the first time, dismissing them as the paranoid ramblings of an eccentric manager. Some jobs aren't worth any amount of money, some places are better left alone, and some rules exist for reasons that go far deeper than anyone should ever have to discover.